thank you so very much for being with us here today. David, let's begin with a paper that you wrote in the Jerusalem Post as an opinion piece. And you wrote a paper which was entitled, Mahmoud Abbas is waiting for a Biden administration. I repeat, Mahmoud Abbas is waiting for a Biden administration. And within that, you wrote the following. You said, quote, relations, namely relations between the Palestinians and the Palestinian Arabs and the United States administration, relations are at their lowest point since the start of the Oslo process. Mahmoud Abbas is almost certainly hoping for the return of a US Democratic administration, one he believes will turn back the clock on several recent US policies regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, before I ask you about that, there's a reason that I've brought up this photograph of Saeb Erekat. He was the chief negotiator for the Palestinian Authority. He worked very, very closely with Yasser Arafat. He was involved in the Oslo peace process. He died recently following illness. I'd like to know, please, what your thoughts are on Saeb Erekat. What was his life lived doing, please? What is his legacy?
Yes, Benjamin. First of all, I must tell you that I knew Saeb Erekat, the late Saeb Erekat, for approximately 30 years, since the beginning of the 90s. I saw him, as I've told you before, many, many, many times. He was very much knowledgeable as regards to the agreements, the Oslo agreements signed between Israel and the PLO. He knew the agreements by heart. He knew every paragraph in the agreement. And he was a very much tough negotiator. He would stand for the Palestinian issues, Palestinians' positions in the framework of negotiations. This is the main legacy of Saeb Erekat, when I remember him as our partner in the negotiations in the Oslo process and later on.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I know that you had a relationship with him whereby you were working and negotiating. I also want to put forward another aspect of his legacy. That man was a mouthpiece for terrorism. He was a man who oftentimes would speak to the virtue of murderous terrorist activities that separated men from their limbs, women from their children, children from their families, Israelis from their own lives. And I actually think that his legacy is one of providing verbal and diplomatic cover to some of the most horrendous murderous activities taking place against innocent Israelis, Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way, David, over a sustained period of time, at least, including but not exclusively known as the Second Intifada. The man is someone who I will share with you, despite people feeling somewhat differently to me. I will be very, very pleased if his memory is ground into the dust of the earth, and if the policies that he espoused follow him towards that fate. Because by saying that Israel must accept the right of return, must give East Jerusalem, must evacuate all communities in Judea and Samaria, he knew very well that he was placing conditions in front of the Israelis that the Israelis could not accede to, whether it was left-wing Israeli governments or right-wing Israeli governments. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when Israel could not respond to those demands, and there was an absence of progress in those areas, he then went on to not somewhat, but explicitly defend repeatedly acts of terror and murder that took place across a sustained period of time. But I do appreciate that you see him as a negotiator, as an interlocutor. But let's turn now, David, to the issue of the Biden administration. I really want to get to that issue. So my first question is this. Let's go back to your opinion piece, which you said the following. Mahmoud Abbas is almost certainly hoping for the return of a US Democratic administration, one he believes will turn back the clock on several recent US policies regarding the Israel-Palestinian conflict. What policies do you think will be turned back on themselves that we've seen recently under a Biden administration with regard to the Palestinian Arab issue?
Yes, it's very cut and clear. First of all, you are right by quoting me. I think that there is no doubt and no question about the Palestinians that prefer to see a Biden administration and not the continuity of Trump administration in the United States. This is very sharp and clear cut that this is like the stand of the Palestinians of Abu Mazen, not to see Trump continuing in his post as president of the United States. They would like to see, I would say, withdrawal from Trump's period of time policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And first and foremost, I'm speaking about, giving legitimacy to the settlements in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. Only today, I don't know if you are familiar with the facts, Secretary of State Pompeo was in Israel. He met Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he visited for the first time, as I recall, one of the settlement, the Israeli settlement, Jewish settlement in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, this is the first time I can recall such a visit. And he spoke about recognition from the American side, from the United States, of the settlements, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This is something in which Abu Mazen would like to see a retreat, a withdrawal from the American administration. And he would like to see Joe Biden as the president-elect, taking decisions, first of all, in this regard. This is something very much important for the Palestinians. In addition to that, Benjamin, Abu Mazen would like to see some decisions taken by the new American administration. First of all, the reopen of the Palestinian embassy or Palestinian mission in Washington that was closed by a Trump administration. He wants this is something very important for the Palestinians to see it. In addition to that, we would like to see no legitimacy, as I've told you before, for the settlements, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And I think that there are some more, I would say, issues that are on the table, which are concerned the Palestinians, and they are waiting Biden administration to take. They would like to see, one of the decisions that they would like to see from Biden administration is the renewal of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. They would like President Biden to be involved in pressing upon Israel to have, concessions, to give in to the Palestinian side in order to reach, at the end of the day, an agreement. I think that this is something which is, in the prevailing circumstances, is not realistic. But this is something, of course, that the Palestinians would like to see in the future. This is something that I recall now from Abu Mazen's side as regard to the new American administration.
So another aspect that you spoke about, David, was the appointment of the ambassador, in this case, Ambassador David Friedman. In your article, you explained that was quite a controversial decision. Some people thought so. I didn't think so. I thought it was what's termed a blessed decision to have such a great friend of Israel as the emissary of the United States to the State of Israel. But it was controversial in some people's eyes because Ambassador Friedman, as a private citizen, was known to be supportive and somewhat of an investor in communities in Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem and other places. You seem to be alluding to the idea, David, that there will be a change in the bona fides of America's ambassador to Israel. Do you expect that we'll see a reemergence of individuals like Martin Indyk, for example, who's known to be a little bit less sympathetic? Martin Indyk, for example, just wrote a eulogy lionizing Saeb Erekat. Are these the sort of returns that you expect will happen? And are these the sorts of returns that you think Mahmoud Abbas wants to happen under a Biden administration?
Yes, 100%. You are right. I mean, first of all, he saw David Friedman as like an American-Israeli agent, I mean, from the point of view of the Palestinian side. They saw him as more Israelis than the Israelis, because David Friedman's approach and position vis-a-vis the settlements in Judea and Samaria was not a secret for the Palestinian side, for Chairman Abu Mazen, for Mahmoud Abbas. And they treated him as such, I mean, during his period of time in the last couple of years when he was ambassador in Israel. I think that now the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, would like to see a different type of an American ambassador in Israel. As you have mentioned before, someone which will not be biased in his idea, in his, I would say, attitudes towards Israel, and to be more, I mean, more than neutral. I mean, to go and to support even the Palestinian side in the conflict with Israel. So only today I've seen in the Israeli press some articles dealing with the subject of a new American ambassador in Israel. And there were names being mentioned in this regard. All the names that I saw, including one name that you very much know, the prior ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro.
Ambassador Dan Shapiro.
Dan Shapiro. They spoke about the possibility that he will be appointed by the new American administration to be an ambassador again. All these ambassadors are more, from the point of view of the Palestinians, are more, I would say, neutral, not biased, I mean, to Israeli stands and positions. And this is something that Abu Mazen would like to see. He won't like to see again a new ambassador at the same model of David Friedman, which was totally, in their eyes, pro-Israel, pro-settlements, against the Palestinians. This is very much cut and clear from the Abu Mazen and the Palestinian point of view.
Now, one of the seminal diplomatic initiatives of the Trump administration was what was termed, although they never termed it as such, but it was termed in the populace, the deal of the century. And this was a blueprint, an outline, subject to negotiation, but a blueprint and an outline for the establishment of a Palestinian state side by side with the state of Israel. I'll talk a little bit more about that if necessary. Tell us, under a Biden administration, what is the fate of the Trump administration's deal of the century? Does it have legs, or have those legs now been cut from underneath it? And if so, what will be the parameters that a Biden administration is expected to seek to impose or to suggest?
Listen, the answer to this question, to this issue, is very cut and clear. The Trump deal of the century is no more valid, is no more on the table of future negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, I don't know if you saw the map that the Palestinians...
I'm very, very familiar with the map.
Yeah, the map. I mean, the deal of the century of President Trump was not even the beginning from the point of view of the Palestinians for talks and negotiations. It was totally unaccepted by the Palestinian side as a basis for any negotiations with the State of Israel. They, of course, this is something today, they even spoke about it loudly and publicly, that the deal of the century is no more any, I would say, plan for peaceful negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Listen, the main thing that the Palestinians would like to see is the stopping of construction and expanding the Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. This is something very much, I would say, important for the Palestinians. They would like at the end of the day to see an Israeli evacuation, withdrawal from the settlements. But they are, you know, during the negotiations which took place in the 90s, they even say that they are ready for exchange of territories. That is to say, if some settlements are going to stay in Judea and Samaria, they would like equivalent, I would say, area in the Israeli side, in the Israeli of the Green Lines, to be under Palestinian sovereignty. But the issue of the settlements is very much important and sensitive for the Palestinians, and they would like to see Israeli withdrawal from the settlements.
And in your view, do they expect that a Biden administration will move towards a withdrawal?
Listen, in theory, they would like Israel to withdraw and Biden's to press upon Israel to withdraw and to evacuate the settlements. But I think that they are realistic. They know that this kind of development is not realistic. At least I think at the end of the day, they would like to see Israeli withdrawal from the majority of the area in the West Bank. And maybe they will accept the principle of exchanging of territories. That is to say, if Israel is going to stay in some settlements in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, they would like the same, I would say, size of territory in the Israeli of the Green Lines to be under Palestinian sovereignty. But they are realistic. I think all partners to the peaceful negotiations now are realistic. And the possibility to renew negotiations in the prevailing circumstances between Israel and the Palestinians are very, very far away. I think it's not something realistic today. And this is my analysis. I think, in addition to what I'm saying, Abu Mazen is 85 years old this November, 85 years old. And I don't know if Abu Mazen will stay with us many years to come in order to be a partner for peaceful negotiations with the State of Israel. And as a matter of fact, during the last several years, especially during the last year, 2020, the Palestinians are trying to pave the way for a new successor, for a new leader to lead the Palestinians after the period of time of Mahmoud Abbas.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Iran now as a subject because it's been in the news indirectly, some would say directly, because of what has transpired within Syria. So to put everybody into the context, there were a series of mines set, armed, and laid out for the detonation and killing specifically of Israeli troops who were patrolling the border. And the state of Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, has detonated certain Iranian strongholds within Syria, saying that they will not allow an Iranian presence to build up there. And what they said there from the Israel Defense Forces, and I'm quoting, is they said, Iran, we are watching you. We will not allow Iran to entrench itself in Syria. But the reality of the matter is Iran is pretty entrenched inside Syria. And I don't know if the IDF has the ability to remove it or turn it back on itself. So let's ask a question about Iran in the context of a Biden administration. Just tell us a little bit about the retaliatory strikes, David, that took place against those Iranian assets that I mentioned inside Syria. And tell us a little bit about the readiness of Israel to attack military installations, but not to eliminate, and you're someone who's dealt with targeted assassinations, among other things, during your career, but not a willingness to eliminate Iranian operatives. I know there were some Syrians killed in the strike, some say 3, some say 10, but generally speaking, all efforts were made to avoid the killing of personnel. What is Israel communicating by detonating facilities, not eliminating representatives or terrorists of the Quds force?
Listen, first of all, this is not something new when I'm speaking about the Israeli stand, the Israeli position vis-a-vis the Iranian, I would say, involvement and presence in Syria. We have seen even in the past Israeli, attacks against Iranian bases and Iranian Al-Quds, guard inside Syria. And as a matter of fact, I must tell you in the beginning, in principle, that from the Israeli point of view, from the point of view of the Israeli government, the Israeli Ministry of Defense, the Iranian involvement and presence in Syria is a red line from the Israeli point of view. And as long as there will be Iranian military bases and military presence in Syria, Israel won't, I would say, hesitate to attack these bases, these Iranians, in order to complete with the Iranian presence in Syria, which is, as I've said before, a red line from the Israeli point of view. And this is why we have witnessed in the last couple of days the Israeli attacks on bases related with Iran inside Syria. And this is not something which nobody knows. I think that in the future, if this involvement in Syria will continue, we'll see similar attacks taking place by the Israeli Defense Forces inside Syria. This is something very much essential and very much, I would say, basic from the Israeli point of view, not to see involvement of Iran in Syria. This is something Israel won't accept in the future, and it's, as I've said before, a red line from the Israeli point of view. And this is why I think that in the future, of course, if the Iranian presence in Syria will continue, Israel will have to act in a military way, in the military attacks, in order to try to persuade, I think, the Iranian Ayatollah's regime to complete and to withdraw from the Syrian territory. This is one of the basic, I would say, policy line of the IDF and the Israeli government vis-a-vis the Iranian involvement in Syria.
So let's again focus this in now, David, on the Biden administration. You, of course, recall that the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, was a deal that was struck and brokered by the Obama administration with Joe Biden as the vice president. This was an extremely problematic deal. It's a deal from which the Trump administration withdrew and sought to tighten up and make more robust if they were going to re-enter that deal. That never came about during the Trump administration. But does Israel feel that a Biden administration will seek to rejoin and re-implement the JCPOA?
Yes, Benjamin. Unfortunately, I think so. I would like to tell you, first of all, that we are now before the period of time of President-elect Biden in the White House. So all what we can say about the future positions of Biden administration is something premature, because he's not in the White House right now. But in accordance with the positions being declared during the elections campaign, and on the basis of the 8 years he was the vice president of President Obama in the White House, I think that we can walk on a solid ground by saying that there is a possibility, and this is, Benjamin, I think, the negative aspect in Biden's administration, future administration in the White House. I'm speaking about I would say, the attitude, the stand, the position of the American administration of Biden vis-a-vis the agreement with Iran, vis-a-vis the fact that the former president of the US, President Trump, withdrew from the agreement with Iran and took a more aggressive and active, I would say, stand and positions vis-a-vis the Ayatollah's regime in Tehran. I'm saying this, and this is very much said from my point of view, that I think that at the end of the day, and you were right by saying so, the new American administration is going to come back, to return to the agreement signed between the powers, the 8 powers, including United States, Russia, etc., and the Iranian regime. This is something I think from the Israeli point of view is very much negative. We don't want to see this agreement being active and being respected again. I think that the positions took by the Trump administration was the right way to deal with the Iranian dangerous nuclear capabilities that are going to be developed in Iran. And I think that coming back to the agreement of 2015, between the 8 powers and Iran, is something that we as Israelis, the Israeli government, we see it as a negative step, as a negative development, because I think we don't have to deal with Iran and giving Iran the room in order to develop in the future nuclear military capabilities. This is something out of question from the Israeli point of view. And I would say, I think that at the end of the day, in accordance to what I've heard during the last couple of years from Biden and in the last elections campaign, maybe President Biden is going back to the agreement signed between the 8 powers and Iran in 2015. And this is something from the Israeli point of view very much negative when we see the ambitions and the plans taken by Iran in terms of developing nuclear military capabilities.
Now, David, I know that you've said it's bad, and I know that you've said you're concerned that there will be a return to that deal. I want you to remind everybody on this call, what in that deal was bad? What in that deal was negative? Just give us 1, 2, 3 examples.
Listen, first of all, I would like to say to you in principle that I don't believe I would say the Iranians, while they are saying that they want to quit from the developing nuclear military capabilities. This is something that we have to take, into consideration in the beginning. And at the end of the day, when we are speaking about the deal, it gives Iran a certain period of time or several years not to continue with development the nuclear military capabilities. But what will be after this period of time? This is one major question. We have to seek for, I would say, a formula which will give us guarantees that the Iranians are quitting, are abandoning the desire to develop nuclear military capabilities. And in the agreement of 2015, there is no guarantee. It gives Iran several I would say, years in order not to develop, but at the end of the day, they are going to return to the nuclear, ambitions, nuclear military ambitions. This is something totally unacceptable. And this is why, by the way, Benjamin, that like 8 years ago, there was a possibility of an Israeli military attack on the nuclear military bases in Iran. I don't know if you are familiar with the facts. It was during the period of time, the beginning of the period of time of Netanyahu as the Israeli prime minister. And when we saw the international community behavior and stand vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis the Iranian desire to develop nuclear military capabilities, the planes were ready for the raid, for a military raid on the nuclear basis in Iran. And at the end of the day, no order were given to the Israeli plans to attack. I think at the end of the day, you have to understand what are the Israeli concerns. It's not a matter of a base here or there, military base here or there. It's a matter of survival. And this is why we are not only concerned, we have to take all the measures and the steps in order to prevent the Iranians from developing nuclear military capabilities because it has to do with survival when we are speaking about Israel. And by the way, I must tell you, on the basis of my experience as an officer in the IDF and later on in the Ministry of Defense, in the defense establishment, it's not only a concern of Israel when I'm speaking about the Iranians' desire to develop, at the end of the day, military nuclear capabilities. It's the concern of the pragmatic, moderate Arab regimes in the area, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Gulf Emirates. And there is no doubt now, in the last couple of weeks, before a couple of weeks, we have seen for the first time a peace agreement, normalization between Israel and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and Sudan going on. And the fact that they came to have peaceful agreements with Israel, normalization, is first and foremost because the Iranians, I would say, threat on the regimes, the pragmatic, conservative Arab regimes in the Middle East. So it's not only an Israeli concern, at the same breath, at the same time, it's a concern of the pragmatic, traditional regimes in the area.
So I have one more question about Iran, and then I still have a couple of other topics I want to get to with you. On the issue of Iran, Business Insider released a story where they interviewed a number of representatives of NATO off the record, and they came out with the following quote. They said, this quote is attributed to NATO representatives. It says, "I'm afraid the Saudis or the Israelis might see a sympathetic ear leaving the White House and a hostile one arriving, and think that perhaps this will make a confrontation inevitable." A second NATO official went on to say, quote, "Both countries," meaning Saudi Arabia and Israel, "are run by immature leaders who have been screaming about," have you ever heard such a thing? "Who have been screaming about the need for war with Iran for so long, it's possible they really believe that a Biden administration will be followed by an Iranian nuclear attack." There's an idea here, David, being spoken about that because of the incoming Biden administration, and I want you to pass this out for us, there may be a rush by the Israelis or the Saudis or a combination of a number of forces there in joint operation with the Americans to hit Iran now during the lame duck session. Do you think that's likely to happen? You spoke about high readiness in the past. Is that high readiness back?
Yeah, first of all, I must tell you something as regard to the Trump administration. I've read in the newspaper in the last couple of days that President Trump was ready to give an order for the American army to attack the Iranian bases, nuclear bases. And this is something we have to take, of course, into consideration. At the end of the day, in accordance to what I've read, the American or President Trump decided not to exercise this attack against the Iranian military nuclear bases. Listen, this is going to be number one challenge which are going to face Israel, and I think at the same time the United States of America, the Biden administration. I think that Israel will prefer in the future not to be the only state exercising a military attack against the nuclear military bases in Iran. I think it's like a strategic position of Israel to see mutual agreement with the United States of America when speaking about the Iranian nuclear threat. And this is why I think that at the beginning, Israel will try to find ways to come to an agreement with the Biden administration in America, and not to do, unilaterally and alone any military aggression against Iran. But at the end of the day, again, I must tell you this issue, Benjamin. When speaking about the Iranian potential threats, nuclear threats, vis-a-vis Israel, I think that at the end of the day, the Israeli decision will be taken when speaking about what amount of threat is stemming from the Iranian regime, and this is something that will, I think, influence the decision taken by the State of Israel. As I've told you before, we prefer, of course, a dialogue and an agreement with the American side, with the United States of America. But at the end of the day, when speaking about Israeli survival, we have to take into consideration a potential decision taken by Israel by itself vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear capabilities. And this is something, of course, that we have to take into consideration. All the parties involved, including the United States, the European, etc., to take into consideration, because when speaking about survival, there are no, calculations in this regard. A state which will, want to protect the civilians, the Israeli population, will take any decisions which are needed in order to protect and to save the survival of the population in Israel.
So I've got two more subjects I want to ask you on, and I'm going to try and keep it to a concise format, David, before we open up. Can you still see me and hear me okay? I just saw
Yes, it's okay.
Great. So I want to talk about normalization. You've just spoken about that, David. Normalization between Israel and her Arab neighbors or Arab states in the region. Do you expect that the Biden administration will continue this march towards normalization, this incredible historical march toward normalization that we've seen between Sudan, Bahrain, the UAE? If so, do you think that Saudi Arabia might be next?
Yes, first of all, Benjamin, we have to pay tribute. I'm speaking as an Israeli citizen. First of all, to President Trump for investing all the energy through, of course, his aides, his assistants, in order to bring Arab states to sign peace treaties, normalization with the State of Israel, which is of historic dimension. First of all, I must tell you that we have signed peace treaty with Egypt in the year 1978 between the late Menachem Begin, the Israeli Prime Minister, and the late Mohammed Anwar Sadat, the President of Egypt. The first, peace treaty signed between Israel and an Arab country. And afterwards, 15 years later, in October 1994, we have signed a peace treaty with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This time it was the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and the late King of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, King Hussein. Since then, we have tried to reach, in the framework of negotiations, through negotiations, a peace treaty, a solution with the Palestinians. But this is like the first time, after so many years, after the signing of these peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, that two other Arab countries, Gulf Emirates, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, are not taking into consideration the Palestinian issue and are saying loudly, clearly, publicly, we are ready to sign peace treaties with the State of Israel. Only a couple of days ago, listen, it was like a dream. We saw the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bahrain in Israel, in Jerusalem, meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, meeting with Secretary of State Pompeo in Jerusalem. This is something, in the past, it would have been like a dream that, will not come and be true. In any case, I think that even during Biden's administration, Biden period of time as president, I think that we will see, and I hope so, efforts taken by the United States of America to expand the circle of peace in the area of the Middle East. And you are right by saying, listen, if Saudi Arabia is going to enter to the circle of peace, this is something of enormous significance, not only from the Israeli point of view, but from the regional point of view, from the Middle Eastern point of view. And this means at the end of the day that we are going to see a more peaceful Middle East than we used to see before. I think that there will be pressures being exerted by the Biden administration on the Saudis to go on with normalization. You know, in the way, I mean, after Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, we have to speak about Sudan, which agreed to sign and to continue with normalization with Israel. I think Oman is another candidate. Morocco is another candidate. But Saudi Arabia is a very, I would say, key state, Arab state, in order to join the circle of peace in the area.
And you do expect expect the Biden administration to continue that. You do expect them to work towards that.
I think that even the Biden administration will understand and will know that this is something of historic dimension and can change the very reality of the Middle East area, of the Middle East. And, you know, I mean, to transfer the Middle East from an area of war, on battlegrounds, disputes, conflicts, etc., into an area of peace. I think the most important thing that I would like to emphasize in this regard, you know, that until, the last period of time, the last year, the Palestinian issue was the main obstacle in the way of signing peace between Israel and Arab countries. But what's important now, that despite the conflict going on between Israel and the Palestinians, Arab countries said in a loud and clear and public voice, we are ready to sign peace treaties with the state of Israel, with the Jewish state.
David, do you think that a Biden administration, given that you said that you imagine they might return to front-loading the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or the Israel-Palestinian conflict and its resolution with regard to their foreign policy, do you think that they may throw that into the works of normalization and essentially throw a spanner into those works, tying extended, continuing normalization to first resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict? In other words, that they might return to the orthodoxy that we've seen endure for some 30 years that said we must resolve the Israel-Palestinian issue in order to broaden the circle of peace? Or do you think that they might be beyond that now and will continue whether the Israel-Palestinian negotiations continue or discontinue?
You are speaking from the point of view of the American administration, of Biden administration.
Yes.
Listen, I think, I don't know. Again, we are walking in not a solid ground right now in terms of what will be the American stance and positions. But I think that first of all, the American will bless the continuity of agreements that will be signed, normalization process between Israel and Arab countries. At the same time, and this is something I would like to emphasize, I think from the Biden administration, the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is something that even the Biden administration would like to see progress, would like to see steps ahead in order to reach, at the end of the day, peaceful solution. I think that it won't occur, any beginning of any negotiations within a short period of time. I would like to tell you in this respect that I think that when we're speaking about the Middle East, there will be a period of time of the new administration of half a year, maybe a year, until they will enter in a very, I would say, intensive way to the Israeli-Arab issues, conflicts in the area. And this is because, the first time the Biden administration will have to focus and concentrate on internal domestic problems. basically the corona issue, the corona epidemic, and the economic conditions in America. But after that, I think that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is maybe one of the basic issues that the Biden administration will have to focus on and to concentrate, and trying to enhance the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. I told you in this regard that looking the gaps between Israel and the Palestinians right now, I'm not very much optimistic that something will come out of it in the coming years.
David, let me ask you.
We have to wait and see a change, a real dramatic change in the Palestinian position vis-a-vis the state of Israel in order to see this process to occur in the future.
David, listen, it's a period of tumult in the United States of America. There are many American Jews who are great supporters of the state of Israel, but to play off what you just mentioned, the problems domestically in the United States of America compelled them to vote one way or another, perhaps even over foreign policy considerations, perhaps over the Zionist considerations, their pro-Israel considerations. It's been a very, very difficult period in the United States. I myself have been here for a long period of time, and I don't think the US is exceptional for facing a difficult period of time. With that having been said, before I do bring it to the audience, we've spoken quite a bit about challenges that will follow the arrival of a Biden administration. What are some of the unique opportunities? What are some of the things that a President Trump could not have gotten done, in your judgment, but a Biden administration just might be able to do in order to bring about a positive impact upon the Middle East? Is there anything there that springs to your mind?
Listen, we are living in a very tough neighborhood in the area, in the Middle East. And first of all, I must say that in the last 4 years, during the period of time of Trump as president, he did a lot in terms of supporting the state of Israel vis-a-vis all the conflicts in the area, basically with the Palestinians. I would like to hope that in the future, when President-elect Biden is going to come to office and to function as the president of America, he will have more influence on the Palestinian side in order to see, to pave the way for the Palestinians and the Israelis to come back to the negotiating table. This is something very much hard and difficult, but I would like to see the American administration take a more serious and firm, I would say, ways in order to press upon the Palestinians to come back to the negotiating table and to discuss with the Israeli side all the core issues standing on the negotiating table, on the table of negotiations, including settlements, including, of course, Jerusalem and the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. This is something which I would like to see from the Biden administration, although I won't hide of you that I'm not very much optimistic in this regard, looking the prevailing, conditions from both the Palestinians and the American administration.
Thank you very much, David. Harold, you're on.
Thank you, Colonel, for sharing your viewpoint. My question is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that he has had a 40-year warm relationship with Joe Biden and that the president-elect is pro-Israel. Should we believe him?
Yeah, first of all, this is the Prime Minister of Israel. We must believe him. I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is cheating or saying wrong things as regard to his relations with President-elect Biden. I myself, from as an observer from the side, know that President-elect Biden was pro-Israeli in many decisions he took. I even remember, but there are some kind of misunderstanding and I would say differences of opinion. I remember that in the last visit of President-elect Biden to Israel, I don't know the year exactly, but there was a problem with giving, instructions by the Israeli government, by Netanyahu's government, for constructing in one of the settlements in the area of Jerusalem, one of the quarters of the Jerusalem it was in the Palestinian side until 1967. And there was some kind of misunderstanding in this regard with Biden. He was that period of time vice president of President Obama. But I think that to a large extent, during the period of time of Biden in the Senate and as vice president, he was not against the Israeli side. He supported Israel. He's very much known for being a supporter for the state of Israel. I'm not afraid of, Biden taking anti-Israeli positions. There are issues that we have to be worried, that we have to explain our concerns to the new president in America, to Biden's administration. And I hope that they will be understanding for the Israeli concerns and the Israeli interest in this regard. So I can tell you that I, first of all, believe Prime Minister Netanyahu. And 40 years is something that we have to take into consideration of recognition between Netanyahu and President-elect Biden.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Harold, for your question. I'm going to ask you another question that was sent in to us. You alluded to it during one of your earlier statements, David, but I am going to come back on it because I think this is something that does trouble a number of people. So on March 8th, 2010, there was something of a debacle between Vice President Joe Biden and the State of Israel. During this visit to the State of Israel, there was an announcement that there would be a community that was going to be developed and expanded. Now, it says that it says here in the quote, it says that yesterday, the decision by the Israeli government to advance planning for new housing units in East Jerusalem undermines trust, the trust that we need right now in order to begin profitable negotiations. And a lot of people saw that as a bit of a warning that an Obama administration at the time, and now a warning that perhaps a Biden administration will be very forceful on the issue of the communities in Judea and Samaria. You call them settlements, I call them communities. The communities in East Jerusalem, you call them settlements, or might call them settlements, I call them communities. That's for us to discuss, but there are two views on this issue. One is that is absolutely a warning shot that this will be a brutal, insistent administration on the issue of communities in Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem. And then there's another view, which is that it was blown out of proportion. It should not have been blown out of proportion. The statement that the Vice President Biden made is not that consequential, and that people should rest easy because this is a bona fide friend of the State of Israel. And when compared to others who were seeking the nomination, for example, Bernie Sanders, who is not a friend of Israel, he's an opponent of the State of Israel, we should actually breathe a sigh of relief that it is Joe Biden coming as the President of the United States and not some of the others who are vying for the same office. What would you advise our listeners to take away from previous statements that you have alluded to? Are they catastrophic, or do they need to be put in a context? And what is that context? Is this a friend of Israel?
Yes, I think that in principle, we are not speaking about a hostile president-elect. I'm speaking about Biden. I can see some misunderstandings and conflicts which can occur between the Israeli side and the United States of America under Biden administration. But at the same time, I think that the Biden administration has to understand the principles guiding the Israeli government when we are speaking about the territories, about Jerusalem. First of all, you have to take in mind something very much important. Since 1981, I think, United Jerusalem was declared as the capital of the State of Israel.
And I'm speaking East and West alike. I mean, all Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. And this is something, first of all, you have to take, even the United States of America into consideration. We are a sovereign state. We are taking our resolutions and our decisions based on our interests, based on our, historic, connection with these areas. And this is something that foreign leaders and foreign countries has to understand and to honor. At the same time, we understand the American, I would say, position in this regard. They would like to see an opportunity to pave the way to continue with the peace process with the Palestinians. As I've told you in answering another question that you have raised, we are ready to come with the Palestinians to negotiations and dealing with the Palestinians and discussing all the core issues, including Jerusalem. We are ready to have discussion with the Palestinians about Jerusalem. They will come with their own positions, we'll come with our positions, and we'll try to find a way in order to reach a solution. I'm not saying that this is a smooth, easy way for a settlement between us and the Palestinians. But at least this is the beginning. We have to try. If we are not going to try, we are not going to succeed.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.